Ximena?
Well, welcome everyone. Today we'll hold an exchange of opinions regarding the issue of the courts, the world's largest nation without a state. And I'd like to welcome Antoine, Sofia, Pamela, Maud, Audrey, and I as a moderators of this chat. We're going to start off by asking their stakeholder assessments in terms of their dynamics,
in which each collaborator will represent a country as Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. So for start our debate or this reunion, I'll ask the question to Iran, if you can answer. Which actors and interests do you identify as the most important?
Well, first of all, there is the Kurdistan regional government, which I think there's one in any other country, in Syria, in Turkey, and in Iraq. I want to point out that Iran really depends on Iraq on economic matters because of trade or any kind of products. So the courts are really into that trade of things, and Iran is really well interested in what the Kurds are taking from Iraq principally. But also there's the Kurdistan Free Life Party, which is like um, basically looking after the human rights of the Kurds. Also the Kurdistan Democratic Party, which is helping in the decision-making process, and the Kurdistan Freedom Party, and the Revolutionary Guards and basic paramilitary are just like a guard force, military force for the Kurds to stay safe. And of course, we cannot forget ISIS, which is a group that it's really conformed by Iranian courts.
Interesting. A lot of group movements and groups. Iraq, would you agree on these actors, or do you have any different ones?
I agree in the actors. I would say the Kurdish factions from each country, the American forces that are involved, Ankara's military government, the Syrian Democratic Forces as well, the government of Baghdad, which opposes to the Kurds on the control of oil, the Iraqi Islamic Party, and the Patriotic Unit of Kurdistan, which is like an ally of Kurdistan Democratic Party, and they are rival from the Kurdistan Islamic Union and the Kurdistan Islamic Group.
Of course, and Turkey, as Iraq says, they have these groups that want to separate the Kurdistan movements. Which actors do you have there like this?
Well, actually, I think it is quite interesting to look at all the shapes that Kurdish within Turkey have adopted, since we have the most sounded case of the KPP, which is a separatist group, probably the most famous because of its current fighting against the Turkish government since 1984. It has been also labeled as a terrorist organization by the US government since 1997. And we also have the Gulen movement, which is the one that perhaps has had the most impact on the Kurdish nationalist movement. It has adopted the Kurds nonviolence discourse within the narrative. Also, you have the Turkish government, of course, which I think, and according to many scholars, is quite concerned about the integrity of the very state, as we know currently. But also you have the Islamic ratifications of Kurdists, such as Hezbollah, which has launched attacks against the above-mentioned PKK during the 1980s, primarily accusing it of its divisive discourse, its secularism, and for murdering Muslims, allegedly for which it was supported by the Turkish government.
Of course, and we have involved this fight against the ISIS, in which it commands the country of Syria. Syria, which actors do you have involved in this situation?
We have the Caliphate of Daesh, the Bashar al-Assad regime, of course, the PYD, which is the Party of the Democratic Union for the Kurds, which was legalized by Assad, but in order to divide the opposition, and they demand management of the Rojava region. The PKK, which is the Kurdistan Workers' Party, and it is a Syrian branch of the PYD. The SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, dominated by the PYD. The French army, which fight against Daesh but not against Assad. The American troops, which fight against Daesh but not Assad too, but since the mandate of Trump, the troops are withdrawn. The Turkish troops, which fights against Kurds in the north of Syria, and the JRK, which is the regional government of Kurdistan, created by Peshmergas, which means the Kurdish fighters.
Thank you very much. Ximena?
Perfect. So now that we have already mentioned the actors and their most important interests, and digging a little bit more into this situation problem, can you mention what are some sources of the conflict in the scenario presented in this situation problem?
Well, I can start if you want. I think it is important to first look at the historical roots of this conflict that date back from the fall of the Ottoman Empire back in the 20th century. We have the Treaty of Sigre, which promised Kurds a homeland, as many other nations did for, let's say, Palestinians with the British. And of course, that did not happen. Instead, they ended up living around 4 new countries, the ones we are talking about now. And since then, we have I think it is quite important to differ the real reasons from the Turkish government to engage in this process against the Kurds, because many people believe that Turkish society actually has like a long dated war against the Kurds. That's not true. In fact, they fought together for independence. So I think, as I mentioned earlier, it has to do with the Turkish government concern about the integrity of the state. And that's why up until the 1990s, they had this national policy of cultural assimilation towards the Kurds, which included not allowing cultural rights, segregation in different forms. We also have the issue with Syria, which has impacted in the bilateral relation with the US, since the American government, until the Trump administration, supported the allegedly wing of the PKK in the country in order to create the democratic force to fight ISIS. So that has provoked some tensions. Obviously, there's been continuous fighting up until 2015, when a 2-year ceasefire collapsed due to a suicide bombing that led to President Erdogan ordering to intensify airstrikes on PKK militants in Southeast Turkey. So yeah, I think it has become a conflict that has wars within wars, as we will learn from the other countries.
Excellent. And let's point out how you said that many people outside think that Turkey has some kind of internal and cultural conflict within the Kurds, but it's actually more than just a cultural and also historical conflict. And now that you also mentioned Syria, let's talk about what Syria thinks about these sources of the conflict presented in this scenario. Maud?
Yeah, the Kurds have been mistreated, especially in Iraq by Saddam Hussein, who wanted to eliminate them, and also in Turkey, as you said. They received the support of the USA and the UK against Hussein with a no-fly zone. And now it is in Iraq where they are the most free. So the withdrawal of US troops from the Syria-Turkey border was seen as a betrayal because Erdogan pushed them out of the area. And these people have been betrayed several times by the Western countries who promised them help, Churchill and Kissinger, and now Trump.
Okay, so now we have two different point of views that are like opposed. So now that you mentioned Iraq, how can Iraq explain their point of view into the sources of the conflict? How can Sofia explain this condition?
There has been decades of internal regional conflict between these regions and a large-scale destruction and persecution of the Kurdish population, and also periods of fighting between rival factions. Um, for example, the negotiations between Iraq's Kurds and the government in Baghdad that have always broken down over issues of Kurdish independence. When, for example, Hussein, Iraq's leader, ordered a chemical weapon attack on civilians in the Kurdish region in 1988, the Anfal campaign of extermination against the Kurds of northern Iraq. And well, now one of the main sources of conflict is that the Kurds wish to control the oil-rich city of Kirkuk and to have their own militia, and the government of Baghdad opposes to this situation.
Well, as we can see, there are many internal issues within this conflict. Nevertheless, let's hear finally the Iran point of view. Please, Pamela.
Well, yeah, well, for the Iranian Kurds, the rejection of the hegemonic approach by Iran and the Sunni religious nationalism is like the center base of this conflict. Iranians' economic interest in the Kurdish region is linked to the smuggling routes, crude oil trade. It also receives Iraq products, which I already said, which enhances their wealth, like cars, lorries, bulldozers, and miscellaneous machinery, which are not just subject to any type of sanctions from other parts of the Iranian government. But the Iranian government is really into this interest and why this conflict is still exists for Iranian Kurds. And also, as I said, the implication of ISIS in the region of the Kurds does not benefit Iran at all, and the Kurds are active participants in ISIS activities.
Perfect. So having this context now, we can move to the next question.
Which is, how can these conflicts may be warm? If you want to make a solution or your own elements about your country, for example, Iran, you mentioned right now about the involvement of ISIS, but what will you result in this case?
Well, ISIS and the Kurds are really like an ally. They don't really want to be separated. They want to be separated from the Iran government. So the most obvious thing is to give them their territory and their borders and potentially international recognition while still giving interested in the country's negotiation table in a third and uninterested state for them to achieve a different type of agreement between them and to like have in mind their goals. But if that doesn't happen, at least they can be autonomous like the EZLN in Mexico, but they are still part of Mexico. So that case can be linked to the Iranian government and the Iranian courts. Um, but for ISIS, they have to, at least in the Iran side, they have to have a delimited type of goals and what they are looking for in like the union of the Kurd region, like but in all um, Middle East, not just in Iran.
Turkey, would you agree? Because you have the involvement of United States. So would you say the same about giving their own space, or how would you answer the question?
Well, I think going back to the question of which elements have to be taken into account, it all comes down to the political struggle from Turkish elites, as I have mentioned. We can see this in how Turkish nationalism has been used as an identitarian feature to connect with the domestic audience and create opposition towards the separatist movement. So having said this, the priority here is first to reduce the levels of violence to reach an immediate ceasefire with the presence of international observance, and then to sort of to analyze through the current public opinion to deliberate and negotiate in order to gain consensus over the level of recognition of the court's rights. Paradoxically, I believe that political incentives, especially coming from abroad, may be a driving force for Ankara to shift its priorities. By this, I mean they have applied for European Union membership, which obviously demands for a solution for the Kurdish recognition question. Also, the bilateral relationship with the US, as I've mentioned, as the Erdogan government believes that the People's Protection Unit, the military wing of the Kurdish Democratic Union Party, it's a branch of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which actually the US labeled as a terrorist organization. And when you mention about this safe zone, President Erdogan has proposed actually a safe zone, a safe buffer zone for Syrian refugees and Kurdish fighters against ISIS in Syria following the withdrawal of the US and its military support to the Kurdish Syrian force. It has been widely criticized because there are some concerns that it may pose a risk for human rights protection, as these people will be sent to a zone in current conflict. It is not actually a peaceful territory right now. So there's that concern by the international community and many humanitarian organizations.
Well, of course, it's difficult to arrive to a consensus between each country. However, you mentioned Syria. Syria, would you agree that one of these elements that Turkey mentioned will favor you? Of course, as he said, the protection of Syrians, but also which other elements would you include?
Yes, I agree because the Turkey considers the Kurds, the organization of Kurds, as terrorists, so it's not really in favor of the resolution of the conflict for now. I think we have to keep in mind several points. The opposition between Assad and his people, among the main opposition forces, the Kurds, Daesh, who try to impose its power, the foreign forces who work with the Kurds to fight Daesh in exchange for their future help. Yeah. So, and of course, Turkey, which does not respect the right of non-interference. I think we could rely on the political programs of the Kurds to win the help of the West, because it's about democracy, secularism, social progress, in particular on equality. So it can help to ally the Kurds with the Syrian people to fight against Assad, who will never allow independence to the Kurds.
Thank you very much. Iraq, do you have an opinion about this?
Yes, I would say that the Kurds will have to make eventually an important decision. Like, do they want to reintegrate into Iraq and be reconciled with the other groups in a democratic and constitutional framework, or do they want the region and to become independent? Any serious move towards Kurdish independence will trigger armed conflicts, and there will be hardship and renewed suffering for all sides. And it's everyone's interest, including that of the Kurds, to make the most of this opportunity. And the Kurdish region could become the scene of another round of conflict, in particular in the tension between the USA. And to prevent the recurrence of past frictions and conflict, the KDP and the PUK need to settle their rivalries and to overcome their respective one-party structures.
Okay, thank you very much. As we see, there are a lot of elements. There is, so of course, as we said, a proposal, but it's different from each country to a board, of course, and actually to manage, which lead us to the next question.
Yeah. So taking into consideration what every state has to say about the situation and their context and their political situation. What is the role of reconciliation and which policies could be suggested? For example, we can start by Maud, Syria.
Yes, I'll be brief because we don't have a lot of time left. So just peace and the possibility for all to have a role of free and respected citizen in their fundamental rights, including the rights of to self-determination of people.
Perfect. Okay, so let's move on with Turkey.
Yes, I'll also be super brief. I think we have to embrace Kurdish identities within Turkey that actually support Turkish democracy and non-violence as means to achieve its demands. And also we have a lot of examples to learn, like the Kurdish self-rule in Iraq, advocate to reconcile interests within the context of fighting against in a common front against ISIS in Syria, among other solutions.
Of course. So let's find out the point of view of Iraq.
Well, there has already been seen signs of reshaping the political landscape in Iraq and the emergence of alliances across ethno-sectarian lines, like the 25th Point Memorandum of the Iraq Islamic Party, and a genuine reform that is suggested for the administration and security service that can address the growing dissatisfaction, and also a well governance in Arbil will also have an impact in Baghdad and would help considerably in writing a new chapter in Iraq's history.
Okay, so that's very important that they consider this historical aspect. And finally, Iran, what's your point of view?
Well, as for the KRG and its political parties, the formal policy is the avoidance of sectarian politics and the implementation of steps to build its relationship with Iran on the basis of shared interest and neighboring geography. Regional sectarian polarization is rising and is set to continue if Iran does not adopt a moderate, non-sectarian politics towards the ambition of the courts.
Perfect. So we have a little time left, but we have also 2 questions left. And maybe we can answer them like together, taking into account the point of view of every country. So these questions are: how could you build a long-lasting peace in this scenario? And besides of the human rights, what is the most importance of international law in this case? As we already have seen, international law, it's fundamental within the political context, historical, and also the needs of every country. But how can we reach to something in which every country has their benefits, so as respecting the human rights and also the rights of every country? So let's have like a little conclusion here, maybe. I don't know. Pamela, representing Iran. What do you think about these two questions?
Well, as I said, the non-sectarian politics are important. Also, excluding the courts and granting them their independence in the Iranian case by economic matters could be a possible solution, and also on geographical terms. But besides human rights, if they are granted their sovereignty rather inside each country or as a new one, they could start by that and can be done through an agreement, and also international recognition will play an important role in the enrollment of the courts as an official state before international law and other organizations.
Of course. Iraq, would you agree about this international law, or would you propose another thing in behalf of the human rights?
I will propose that the Kurds can only eliminate their fears about their drive for independence if they reintegrate into Iraq and show like a greater commitment to democratic reforms, and if they look forward to negotiations for obtaining autonomous territories for the Kurdistan region. And about the human rights, I could say that they are important to maintain international peace and security and to refrain the threat and use of force by the state.
The use of force by the state, that you could say that we could create an establishment of a safe zone. I think that Turkey, you have a proposal like that, won't you?
Yes. President Erdogan has pledged to set up a safe zone to return allegedly at least 1 million Syrian refugees. But as I mentioned earlier, in my personal perspective, it has raised alarms in my personal and the perspective of other organizations. It has raised alarms in humanitarian circles where advocates fear that refugees will be forcibly returned to a conflict zone in violation of international law. Regarding how we can build long-lasting peace in this scenario, I think we need to reassess the actors, the stakeholders involved within the Turkish context. We've seen how they've changed over the time. We need to reevaluate the dynamics of group boundaries, how those translate into the centralized government that Turkey currently has, how the levels of intensity within the conflict have changed. And then from that point on, we need to understand and develop intercultural tools to persuade conflict perception within Turkish society, which we know is a powerful mobilizer in the context of a conflict. And what would this create? Well, it would set a precedent in terms of the recognition of stateless nations. We know there are many across the Middle East. I don't think the establishment of a Kurdish independent state is a viable alternative right now, as it would face a widespread opposition across the Middle East. So, well, as I mentioned, we have the example of self-ruled Kurdish in Iraq, we can learn from. So yeah, I think we need to set that precedent within international law.
Thank you very much. With those precedents, how could you build a long-lasting peace in this scenario, Syria?
I see a few main principles, which are not respected and must be respected. The respect for human rights, the protection of civilians, the rights of self-determination of peoples, and the non-interference in the affairs of other countries. So to make this principle respected, I think we should end the Assad regime because it's against democracy. So it could pass by the recognition of the illegitimacy of the totalitarian regime at the UN. Put an end to Daesh's desire for conquest, of course, and negotiate self-managed territories or even a real independence for the Kurds. But nothing can be decided regardless of neighboring countries. So everything should be decided together and with, for example, a commission, trans borders.
Thank you very much. Well, to summarize everything that we discussed in this brief talk about between countries, we can say that it's very diverse, and its relations with its neighborhoods have been crucial issues and a source of divergence between political and ideological currents throughout the modern history. But after decades of covert and over ethnic and sectarian discrimination, they have become the foundation both of the ethno-aggression, power sharing, and of the conflicts right now for the Kurdistan movements and for each actors that they're involved in this idea. So I will return to the main ideas that they were proposed during the end of this problematic, which is the establishment of an autonomous region and protecting cultural rights. Of course, that is not very easy and it's not a feasible solution in the medium term, as Turkey says, but understand and develop intercultural tools and liberate from other regimes that they were involved at the beginning. Of course, this still will take a lot of time in the international relations, and we are still hoping for the opening of good interaction and listening as we did today in this reunion. I don't know if any of my collaborators here want to say something else. If not, I think like we can conclude to this.
Yeah, if I can add something, at least in the case of Turkey, I would like to highlight that we were kind of representing the point of view, the historical point of view of courts in Turkey, not actually the Turkish government. So just to clarify.
Yeah, of course, the involvement of each actor, but of course, with the priority of the courts, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Well, thank you very much. And well,
Thank you.
thank you very much. I think we can end this
you.
conversation. Till next time.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.